Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the final segment of Star Wars The Old Republic Unmasked. Throughout this video series, I've been discussing SWTOR's decade-long history, focusing on each expansion, content patch, and community highlight, all in an effort to summarise SWTOR's lifespan thus far. For those of you who may have missed part 1 and 2 of this documentary series, I've linked both videos in the video description down below. I would strongly recommend watching the prior episodes before watching this one. If you would like to see more of this style of content, do be sure to leave a comment in the comment section down below. I would love to hear your feedback on the episode. Anyway, with that said, sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy yet another Star Wars The Old Republic video.
Birth.
Pain.
Fear. Death.
You live. You know pain. You have learned fear.
Now only death remains.
World of Warcraft players will fondly remember the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, a point of stability for WoW that connotes nostalgic value and is to some considered to be the pinnacle of WoW's lifespan. Elder Scrolls Online players would likely say the same about Morrowind, an expansion of high value with exceptional content additions that only bettered the MMO. The Dread War period was arguably SWTOR's own magnum opus, a period where the majority of the player base was content with the expansion and in extension the content direction. For myself and a lot of the Star Wars The Old Republic community, the latter half of the Rise of the Hutt Cartel expansion was the apex of SWTOR's content span so far. Game Update 2.4, The Dread War, introduced with it Oricon, a hellish biome ruled by the Dread Masters, a pre-established antagonist as mentioned on Belsavis and again during the Dreadseed questline. These Dread Masters were the Emperor's chosen, beings of raw dark side energy and a worthy foe to both the Empire and the Republic. Oricon would be the staging ground for this conflict, and alongside it players would have their eyes opened to new engaging mechanics in both group content and now single player content, as daily missions would now feature mini-bosses. As mentioned, Bioware was keeping the daily grind very straightforward as to preserve the traditional MMORPG experience, especially with Mekeb and CZ198. With Oricon, however, players would be introduced to interrupts and DCD management to overcome various bosses in single player content. This level of difficulty prior to Oricon was exclusive to group content and provided a comforting change of pace for the MMO. This difficulty for newer players would also cement the zone as one of the hardest areas in the expansion and would further give solo players an engaging experience to enjoy. Oricon also made use of the GSI items mentioned earlier by including unique bonus missions specific to the macro binocular items, and further missions for the Seeker droids. The Dread War also included additional reputation vendors with unique rewards as with reputations in the past, the most notable of which was the Hallowed Gothic armor set and the Gurian Volcano mount. The Dread War further added new gear sets, PvP Warzone modes, and overall PvP improvements. The Dread War was in many ways an amalgamation of all of SWTOR's best contents, with the cherry on top being two new operations, the Dread Fortress and the Dread Palace. Both operations were filled to the brim with new mechanics, fights, challenges, and rewards that players would enjoy progressing through for years to come. Both operations would feature 5 bosses, with the last boss being the most challenging. Dread Fortress featured Brontes who would rely on reaches to separate and overwhelm players, whilst Dread Palace featured the Dread Council who would attempt to single out players with one-on-one boss fight encounters. Both operations were incredibly difficult to progress through, especially for new players. This sheer abundance of content following the Dread War left many players satisfied and engaged with the game for months following the patch, eventually leading to the release of a highly anticipated but somewhat puzzling update, intended to resolve the former controversy concerning the space rail shooter system, which was pretty much abandoned by patch 2.0. This system would supposedly serve to revitalize the game's aerial combat and add a new element to PvP unlike anything the player base had ever seen. Introducing Galactic Starfighter. During patch 2.6, the developers added the Galactic Starfighter game mode to Star Wars The Old Republic. Galactic Starfighter is a 12v12 PvP exclusive dogfight game mode available to all players, including free-to-play players. The new mode introduced personal starfighters to the game, as not to be mistaken with one's personal starship. These starfighters came in 4 separate classes: Scout, Strike Fighter, Gunship, and Bombers. Each class utilised various abilities to gain strategic advantage over enemies. Scouts were high speed and nippy, fighters had superior firepower, gunships utilised a powerful railgun, and bombers used destructive missiles to decimate opponents. The Starfighter game mode was rather simple, featuring two sub-modes, Domination and Team Deathmatch. Domination involved capturing key objectives to enable the team to gain points. Points were earned by the team that managed to maintain control of said objectives for the longest period of time. Team Deathmatch was a simple kill or be killed game mode, whereas teams would attempt to defeat members of the opposing team for points. Whichever team had the highest score when time expired would win the match. Galactic Starfighter on paper seemed rather straightforward, with an expanded system allowing further customization of each starfighter, adding a more complex element for those who found the initial system too simplistic. This expanded system incorporated a hangar window which could be used to switch and change out various ship components. New components were purchased using fleet acquisition and a new starfighter specific currency. Players could additionally add crew, the crew being your companions, who would offer specific strategic buffs to your ship. Blitz, for example, featured an ability called Hydrospanner, which would self-heal the ship over time. These varying levels of Starfighter content made for a repeatable game mode experience unique to SWTOR. Unfortunately, this unique game mode was again PvP specific, leaving players who enjoyed the PvE element of the rail shooter rather disappointed, as this overhaul system added a whole new dynamic to the game that could not be engaged with on one's own. Furthermore, Galactic Starfighter's demographic market was already dominated by another of Electronic Arts' titles, this being EA's Battlefront, a game that had a much more intricate, well-balanced and semi-perfected system that outshined Galactic Starfighter in every way. Ultimately, the system didn't perform as well as expected and was sidelined for a few years following its release. Players, however, who enjoyed Galactic Starfighter would continue to play the game mode even till this day. Over time, a few additional maps would be added, such as the Iokath map, alongside a few balance changes, but the mode for the most part would go untouched for several years. This system, therefore, was arguably successful to a degree, and ultimately did add a new avenue of content to an otherwise largely expansive MMORPG. This PvP-focused path left some desiring a refocus onto PvE content, which to no surprise was read loud and clear. This led to the developers adding an expanded raid patch for the existing Dread Fortress and Dread Palace that managed to excite and breathe new life into an otherwise familiar raid scene. This was the new time-limited event, Nightmare Power. Nightmare Power was firstly introduced for Nightmare Dread Fortress and again for Nightmare Dread Palace. Nightmare Power was actually just a simple boss buff. The buff functioned as a damage bolster and health boost placed on every boss in both operations. This buff made the already extremely difficult operations even harder. Players who managed to clear Dread Fortress during this period would get a unique title called Conqueror of the Dread Fortress, whilst players who managed to clear Dread Palace would obtain the unique title Deposer of the Dreadmasters. To reiterate, these titles would only be available during Nightmare Power. Due to the nature of these buffs having an effect only at launch, it made the world first kill for both raids respectively even more commendable, resulting in another epic rush for world first, with Dread Fortress being the first contender. At release, alongside patch 2.7 Invasion, players would enter the raid only to discover that the difficulty curve was much harder than even some of the hardest content prior. Checks were tight, especially with Nightmare Power, and again with gear scarcity, as a lot of the best gear was barricaded behind the very same bosses they were trying to kill for world first. Dread Fortress therefore was arguably going to be a tough prog, especially for the last boss Brontes. Nonetheless, players would need to down all 5 bosses before fully gearing in order to achieve world first. Despite this obstacle, however, Sevenstuck, a German raiding guild, managed to take the world first title and defeat Dreadmaster Brontes before any other guild. The kill itself was spectacular, and so close in fact that the party wiped as they defeated the final boss, which at the time was a truly exhilarating world first. Dread Palace therefore would soon follow suit with its own Nightmare Power event alongside patch 2.8, the Spoils of War. Like Brontes, the race was truly exceptional, with better gearing than Dread Fortress, but still extremely difficult. The world first itself was claimed by a North American guild based on the Harbinger server called Zors. Unfortunately, however, the progression board specifically for Dread Palace had some technical problems and it became very messy, especially as it was so close between both Sevenstuck and Zors. However, Sevenstuck slipped up on the council fight, giving the Zors guild world first, with some members of the team going on to also take the world first time run. PvE has always been a huge part of SWTOR's legacy, with the Dread Fortress and Dread Palace Nightmare Power events forever cementing PvE as one of SWTOR's key selling points. PvP, however, has always been a more controversial element against SWTOR's history, as over the years, ranked especially has been handled with varying degrees of care, which brings us to SWTOR's first ranked PvP season. It may seem as if I've neglected PvP for the majority of this documentary. This, however, is not entirely the case. PvP at launch was rather static, with ranked seasons being yearly, and due to SWTOR having only been out for 1 year by this point, the player base had yet to see a ranked season conclude. As you can imagine, PvPers at this point were also feeling slightly pushed aside, and Bioware would as a result later change the length of ranked seasons to fluctuate better with content release cycles. In the meantime, however, ranked worked in a rather traditional sense following the widely used ELO system, whereas ranks were split into various tiers, with rank 5 being the highest and rank 1 being the lowest, and players would be graded based on their win-loss ratio against other players. This tier score would be calculated after 10 placement matches in one of two categories: solo ranked PvP or group ranked PvP. The contents players had to choose from in ranked was also somewhat bare, with there only being 3 maps at release: Tatooine Canyon, Orbital Station and Corellia Square, with Mekeb Mesa being added alongside Rise of the Hutt Cartel. Ranked, therefore, was mostly overlooked by the majority of the player base, with players instead opting to play Huttball and Voidstar in regular war zones. The ranked climb in SWTOR, furthermore, was extremely difficult, requiring players to constantly queue and play in hopes of upping their ELO score. The outcome was a rather repetitious and grindy fight to reach the top tier, this again being tier 5. The rewards for such were announced rather unconventionally at the end of the season, so for the majority of ranked Season 1, players didn't actually know what they were tangibly grinding for. Eventually, however, the rewards were released, and players discovered they could obtain anything from Garada the Hutt's personal Rancor mount to a variety of weapons and armors exclusive to ranked PvP. The top players would also receive exclusive titles such as S1 All-Star or S1 Champion. Those who had already climbed the ELO ladder were thrilled, but players who were again unaware of the extraordinary value they had missed out on by not participating were unhappy to say the least, resulting in an extremely aggressive ranked grind towards the end of the season, with various exploits even being used. For example, the infamous win trading strategy, where players would deliberately sabotage teams to assure their friend's team obtained a higher rank. Ultimately, the players at the top received their aforementioned rewards, with future seasons going on to reward the 3 best in show for each advanced class in the game, who would then receive a unique title exclusive to them, further incentivizing this aggressive grind. This would crown the start to another 10 years of various ranked PvP seasons and rewards. Around this time, the developers began hosting unique PvP events to keep the community engaged and motivated for the upcoming Season 2. One such event was the Galactic Guild Battles event. Galactic Guild Battles was a Bioware partnered event with the MMO site MMORPG.com that gave the top guilds a chance to livestream their 4v4 player vs player Warzone arena matches live on MMORPG.com's official Twitch channel. There were various criteria for the event, but the victors would receive the unique title Wartime Correspondent for their successful entries. This event, however small, revitalized PvP within the MMO and added an official interactive element to the game that felt much more personal than any event prior. This personal touch and interactive nature made for an extremely passionate event that would open BioWare's eyes to more personal style content, which brings us to patch 2.9 Galactic Strongholds. With the new Galactic Strongholds content patch, aka patch 2.9, players received an array of various player houses to choose from, including Droman Kast, Coruscant, Nar Shaddaa, Tatooine, and later Yavin 4, Rishi, Manaan, Alderaan, the Fleet, and even a train on Umbara. There were multiple means of purchasing strongholds. Players could use cartel coins as associated with the cartel market, players could use credits, or in some circumstances, players could receive houses through redeemable event codes. The housing system added a new way to personalize your Star Wars experience. Through the use of hooks, players could place decoration items around their strongholds. These decorations could be obtained from cartel packs, various flashpoints, and even achievements. Some decorations even had functions, like the slot machine casino decoration, which went hand in hand with the Cartel Bazaar reputation system, as on occasion, you could receive reputation rewards from the slot machine. There were also utilitarian decorations and quality of life decorations such as the personal GTN, guild bank, modification station, and even event vendors. A concern was raised by the community following the announcement of some decoration items. The issue was that by having everything available to the player in their strongholds, it makes travelling around and visiting locations in the game rather unnecessary, and therefore players would spend more time in their strongholds than with other players, which could make the game feel empty. Bioware's response in an attempt to subvert this emptiness was to add the public listings feature, whereas players can toggle on and off public access to their strongholds. This is great for guild events, guild parties, or RP, which has been a common practice in SWTOR since release. Arguably, this did help on a smaller scale, but with players no longer needing to visit the hub fleets, the game population publicly did feel smaller. In spite of this, however, players were enjoying customizing their own strongholds, and players could even purchase a guild-specific stronghold that they could then donate decorations to and further customize for their own guild. This guild stronghold system was incredibly reminiscent of the game's predecessor, the sandbox MMO Star Wars Galaxies, and was a welcome addition to those few players who were maybe still upset about Galaxy's closing. Despite the usefulness, some players did have criticisms of the overall hook system as used to place decorations, which wasn't exactly revolutionary for an MMO, especially when WildStar, Terra and ESO all had their own take on free placement, which allowed decorations to be placed following an XYZ grid system, a system that did not limit players simply to hooks. Most found the hook system to be an unnecessary barrier when decorating and would often point out that ESO used a similar version of the hero engine, so why was it that SWTOR players had to be limited to these hooks? This issue, though commonly discussed, wasn't too pressing of a concern for the developers, as competitors like World of Warcraft featured the significantly worse garrison system, and SWTOR's prime objective at the time seemed to be more about outshining WoW rather than other MMOs of the genre. Players still managed to enjoy the new system, especially guilds now with the ability to create guild bases that encouraged guild-specific interaction. Alongside player housing, patch 2.9's main selling point was yet to be fully realised, a system that integrated with guild flagships and brought the player base together more swiftly than any expansion prior. This was SWTOR's new guild system, named Galactic Conquest. The Galactic Conquest system, in summary, allows guilds to compete against other guilds. The system further allows individual guild members to generate points that then contribute to a guild's total score. The guild is then ranked against other guilds on the server for the promise of valuable crafting resources and other bountiful loot. Conquest points are generated through the completion of rotating weekly objectives. Conquest objectives can vary from completing in-game quests to simply defeating a set number of NPCs within the game. Furthermore, players can use the Conquest system to level up their guild and receive unique guild perks. One such perk being the Operation Fortitude perk, which increases the base health of every player while in an operation. In association with the player housing system, guilds could even purchase their own guild flagship that could be customized and tailored for any given guild. These ships were further upgraded through the takedown of various PvE planetside commanders that dropped encryption items, used to upgrade the guild capital ship and unlock more rooms for guild members to explore. The capital ships themselves, as you can imagine, are the heart and soul of any progressing conquest guild, with guilds often meeting on flagships for events and to assemble for galactic rampages, which is one of the conquest objective types as mentioned earlier. There are also crafting objectives that players can participate in to gain conquest points, which revitalized and repurposed elements of the now older crafting system. There are even specifically conquest tailored resources players could collect to help with conquest, such as invasion forces, war supplies and dark projects. Alongside the successful conquest mode, players would be recalled to their respective fleets to continue with the narrative war effort. Upon returning to duty, the player would be greeted with a new story arc titled Forged Alliances. During the story arc, the player would be given 4 unique flashpoints, released progressively alongside the latter end of the Rise of the Hutt Cartel expansion, whereas Republic players are introduced to an unconventional SIA agent, Theron Shan, as featured in the Annihilation novel by Drew Karpyshyn, whilst Imperial players would work alongside Sith Lord Lana Beniko to counter strategic strikes on Force user homeworlds. The players would both assault and defend the planets of Tython and Korriban, only to discover that the whole conflict was a ruse, staged by high-ranking Republic and Imperial traitors. The player would also be introduced to a Wookiee by the name of Jakaro and his droid translator C2D4, who alongside Lana and Theron would hunt down and expose the traitors from within their own factions. Over the course of the storyline, players would visit Manaan for patch 2.9 and Rakata Prime for patch 2.10, both of which would be packaged with their own respective flashpoints. Alongside these storylines, the player would attempt to further narrow down the traitors from within their own faction, only to uncover that the whole ruse was orchestrated by none other than Revan himself, the former KOTOR protagonist and turncoat Sith Lord. Revan, the Revanite faction, and some of his die-hard loyalists had managed to discreetly amass power from within both the Republic and the Empire. Revan going forward, therefore, would have the sufficient influence and forces to pose a significant threat to the galaxy. To the player's surprise, they are unable to stop Revan, thereby ensuring that his return was indeed confirmed. Forged Alliances and its flashpoints would serve as the prelude to the next expansion, the now revealed Shadow of Revan.
You would save this world only to destroy all of existence?
Think of how many lives the Emperor will consume.
Star Wars The Old Republic Shadow of Revan expansion is the second digital expansion for Bioware's MMORPG. Saw was available for early access, and like Rise of the Hutt Cartel was also available for pre-order, gifting players a grand statue of Revan decoration item for doing so. Update 3.0 fully released on December 9th, 2014. Saw would introduce 2 new worlds, 2 new flashpoints, and 2 new operations. Through this content, players would continue from the pre-established Forged Alliance questline, and again would attempt to stop Revan once and for all. Players through this expansion are now also able to level from level 55 to 60. The storyline follows our antagonist Revan after his surprise attack on Rakata Prime. The player, now referred to as the Outlander, must hunt down Revan and his known associates. Lana Beniko and Theron Shan once again unite with the Outlander as they begin tracking Revan. It turns out Revan has established a base on the planet of Rishi, where Revan has allied himself with various pirate forces, more specifically the Nova Blade Pirates. Revan would go on to use these pirates to stage attacks between both the Empire and the Republic. Revan then further attempts to manipulate the Republic and the Empire into all-out war. This was to shroud his true motives. Revan himself intended to revive the Sith Emperor. Revan's plan was oddly not to then join the Emperor, but instead revive him and obliterate his Force essence, thereby silencing the Emperor forever. Revan fails to trick either the Republic or Empire, and in haste travels to Yavin 4, where the Emperor's tomb is now kept. Now caught on, the Republic and the Empire join forces in an effort to stop Revan from bringing back the Sith Emperor from death. The plot later justifies that Revan has split his Force essence in two, in which his light side and dark side forms have become separated, thus explaining his sporadic and somewhat dangerous actions. Alongside this main story concerning Revan, players would also receive an individual class story that follows characters associated with their respective campaigns. This would differ from class to class with a total of 8 variations, which was a nice change of pace considering the Rise of the Hutt Cartel expansion only featured a Republic and Imperial version with a few minor amendments. Now with the Shadow of Revan expansion, we would finally see continuations of the class stories featured alongside SWTOR's release. To list an example for context, the Imperial Agent storyline would have the agent work with the Old Keeper, a now exiled shadow of his former self. The agent and Keeper would work together to rescue Sarah Jen, the former Watcher 2, and help her be decommissioned as an agent, so she can go back to living her normal life. As you can imagine, therefore, the Shadow of Revan story arc contributes greatly to SWTOR's existing narrative by bringing back a beloved character like Revan and further developing the existing characters who players have begun to cherish and appreciate like Lana and Theron, whilst also offering players a unique continuation of their own class storyline alongside this overlying arc would only sweeten the content pool and further give players closure on loose ends from their former SWTOR campaigns. With the story now established, players were also given the opportunity to explore the new worlds added with Update 3.0, these being both Rishi and Yavin 4. Firstly, the planet Rishi is a tropical pirate's haven at the edge of the galaxy featuring bars, coves and secret hideouts around the zones, whilst Yavin 4 served as the more jungle moon-style planet as featured in the original Star Wars trilogy. Unlike Rise of the Hutt Cartel, these two zones were considered very polished, with interesting datacron hunts, bosses, and most importantly, concise quest placement. The zones were beloved by most and offered smooth, seamless travel as well as relatively good mob spacing, which allowed players to LOS mobs and move around the map at their own pace, whilst also encouraging combat for those progressing through the zone. Critically, Rishi and Yavin were game changers for SWTOR and showed that the developers knew how to expand on their already established MMORPG. Rishi and Yavin further featured their own reputation systems, which complemented the story and kept players engaged with the new zones long after they had completed the story content. Rishi, for example, had players work with the natives of the planet to restore order and reunify the various factions across the world. This galactic reputation, specifically titled The People of Rishi, featured quests that would have players utilize both the macro binoculars and seeker droid items mentioned earlier, whilst also working alongside pirate gangs to further their foothold on the planet. Players would face vicious beasts, Nova Blade pirates, and remnants of the Order of Revan, all whilst obtaining reputation and gaining interesting items, such as the Rishi Outlaw Swoop and the Headhunter armor set. Whilst Yavin would have both the Republic and Empire work together under the Galactic reputation system titled the Coalition Forces on Yavin 4, and would again incorporate the macro binoculars and seeker droid items. Alongside this, players would work to fight strong bosses and enemies, including named Revanite commanders, a Revanite Walker world boss, and even a secret Sith world boss called the Ancient Threat. This made the zone feel rather challenging for new players, whilst also providing a variety of stylized quests that would keep players engaged within the zone. The rewards varied per faction, but players would expect to receive the KX-7 or BA-2 Recon Walker alongside various armoured dies and customization options. These zones were considered generally some of SWTOR's best yet, with such an abundance of content and replayability that most players would see this as a worthy successor to the Rise of the Hutt Cartel expansion. Group content, furthermore, was even in abundance, with Rishi offering 2 separate flashpoints, the first of which, Blood Hunt, would have players venture to a Mandalorian island to learn more about the Revanites. Players on the island would fight Mandalorians as well as their pets. Uniquely, Blood Hunt would offer 6 mini-bosses and 3 main bosses. The mini-bosses featured an RNG element, where you would only fight 3 bosses in any one run, which gave the flashpoint a unique sense of repeatability. Ultimately, players would fight Shae Vizsla, as featured in the original SWTOR cinematics. The following flashpoint, Battle of Rishi, would be much simpler, involving players infiltrating a Revanite outpost and dismantling Revanite leadership from within. The fight would feature a final engagement with Sword Squadron's Command Walker, before the player would be sent to Yavin for one final confrontation with Revan. These flashpoints were only the tip of the iceberg for group content in the Shadow of Revan expansion, with the patch also featuring 2 raids, both with a story mode and hard mode variant. These raids were called Ravagers and the Temple of Sacrifice. Alongside the Shadow of Revan expansion, patch 3.0 brought to the game Operation Ravagers, which offered interesting boss mechanics and encounters on scene in the SWTOR MMO. These mechanics included backstabs, ad manipulation, and even wacky AoE placements that turned arenas into essentially minefields. Telegraphing in this way was a key selling point to the SOR raids. Moreover, the Ravager storyline uniquely offered a more comical narrative than players would have expected, whereas the player would work alongside a pirate captain Rugar to overthrow a pirate captain Cortani, who was apparently responsible for setting up a coup on Rugar, but the player would discover Rugar also staged a coup on Cortani, resulting in this rather funny back and forth between pirate captains. The player concludes this arc by toppling the hierarchy altogether and fighting off both pirates and their minions during this 5-boss operation. Temple of Sacrifice, on the other hand, would further the Revan story arc as established throughout the Saw storyline. The operation itself would serve as a grand conclusion to Revan's legacy. Players could thereby opt into doing this operation instead of their final story mission, giving the community an interesting choice: fight Revan solo in a singular story mission, or take on Revan with a group of 7 friends as you defeat various bosses and penultimately Revan himself as part of one final confrontation at the Temple of Sacrifice. Ravagers and Temple of Sacrifice are interesting operations both from a story and developmental standpoint, as both raids incorporated exceptional mechanics that changed raid mentality for the better. The most notable mechanic being Ravager's own Thermite Rocket Mortar, which would force players into set positioning and change the layout of the boss fight entirely. Whilst Temple of Sacrifice featured Revan's own Aberration mechanic, which would dictate where members would have to visually look in order to survive a specific phase. These mechanics themselves were challenging, but can often be overcome by one experienced member of the raid, often referred to as the Cooler or Raid Leader. The oddity specifically arose when the community began to discuss a Nightmare variant of both these 2 raids, as for these operations specifically, there was only ever a story mode and a hard mode variant ever released. There are a few reasons for this. Some believe the hard mode variants were already difficult enough, some even going as far as to coin the term Hardmare for both operations, a portmanteau of hard mode and Nightmare. Whilst a further argument was made that less than 1% of the player base even enters a Nightmare raid period, and therefore the developers should not focus on pinnacle endgame raiding as a priority on their roadmap. Regardless of the reason, hard mode was considered the highest tier for both operations, and therefore it is quite hard to pinpoint who obtained World First concisely, as the official competitive scene was not as actively tracking progression, probably because, in theory at least, a Nightmare variant would eventually be released. But here we are, half a decade later, with only the HM board to go by. It is believed anyway that Ravagers and Temple of Sacrifice were both first cleared on hard mode difficulty by Zorz, the former World First holder for Dread Palace. Zorz not only managed to clear World First, but also pushed 3 teams through the contents before most teams even had their first clear of the instance. This was arguably due to their experience on PTS prior to the content's release, but even now, players are amazed by their accomplishments as a raiding guild. There was also an interesting exploit that came from Ravagers at the time. This exploit was also in part discovered by Zorz, whereas an 8-man operation group with all bosses cleared could set the group to 16-man. The new operation group of 16 players could walk into the instance and pick up the final boss's loot without killing the final boss. This was due to the loot dropping from a treasure chest mob rather than Rugar. Players could therefore manipulate the spawn of said treasure chest to obtain all the loot from the last boss, which included a set piece chest exotic crafting resources, and even the achievement for defeating the last boss. All this alongside a chance at the rare mount called the Concordian Scout Craft. Exploit aside, with no official Nightmare mode ever released, players were a little disappointed with the lack of physical mechanics, going so far as to post full forum threads listing new ideas for hypothetical Nightmare variants. Some thought Nightmare aberrations could be player-based rather than instance-based, so no one could rely on a cooler. Other ideas were also bumped around, but all in all, SWTOR's Ravagers and Temple of Sacrifice raids were a huge success, and who knows, maybe one day we might get a Nightmare variant. With 3.0 in full swing, the community engagement with the MMO had suddenly spiked, with players actively posting to Reddit threads and blowing up the forums with various discussions, questions and criticisms concerning the game. In response, Bioware's community feedback vamped up dramatically, with the community manager Eric Musco even going as far as to host frequent Twitch live streams, where they would discuss general topics about the game. Musco had of course streamed in the past, but never quite this frequently. The stream team, as it would henceforth be called, would consist of story writer for The Trooper and now lead creative director Charles Boyd, alongside lead designer Michael Backus, and of course Eric Musco, then community manager and now game producer. The three would discuss the game's direction and host live Q&As in an effort to answer the community's more pressing questions. Various guests would also make appearances on the stream, from Bioware's own Bruce McLean and Courtney Woods, to various actors and talent like Darren DePaul, the voice of Emperor Valkorion. The trio would change over time, with Michael Backus being switched out for Ben Ivering, one of EA's former producers, who eventually would leave to work on Anthem, and to then be replaced by Keith Kenegg, who would sometimes feature in streams, but for the most part henceforth, streams would be featuring Eric Musco and Charles Boyd, with the occasional appearance from the community officer Daniel Steed. The stream team throughout its iterations became one of the hallmark selling points for Star Wars The Old Republic. Players through streams and special event meetups called community cantinas would grow closer to the developers of SWTOR, more so than its competitors at the time, with WildStar and Elder Scrolls Online being the only real exceptions to this level of community engagement. Other MMOs would soon follow suit, but for 2014 onwards, SWTOR really managed to hold its own, especially in terms of community feedback and interaction. I'm not claiming other MMOs didn't communicate with their communities. World of Warcraft's BlizzCon was hugely successful and encouraged players from around the globe to meet up and discuss various Blizzard games. RuneScape by Jagex hosted meetups alongside MCM Comic-Con in London, and Star Citizen by Cloud Imperium Games still has regular meetups as part of CitizenCon, despite the game not even having a full release. However, SWTOR's community team, unlike others, made social events personal. People could literally meet for drinks with the developers, regularly talk about the game on Twitch streams, and even hang out in-game. Star Wars The Old Republic took community interaction to a whole new level, despite the game being AAA and ran by a multi-million-dollar corporation. Bioware managed to maintain a level of personal connection with the community, despite being a AAA Star Wars game, which is in itself an incredible feat. As Update 3.0 continued on, players would receive multiple updates and patches that hinted even more so to the Emperor's grand return. With Revan's arc finally concluded, it was clear to most that the Emperor would soon reappear, and to no surprise, he returned with the addition of Update 3.2, Rise of the Emperor. Patch 3.2 offered more content than most anticipated, as the patch dropped a surprisingly large amount of new zones for a single patch. Players would firstly revisit the Imperial planet Ziost, as mentioned in the initial data leak of 2.0. The planet since its findings would be completely reworked to fit the 3.2 patch content, and the planet itself would serve as the epicenter of the Immortal Emperor's return, requiring players to have reached level 60 and further finish the original Shadow of Revan story in Yavin before being able to participate in the event. The planet itself offered 3 subzones and 1 daily zone. The landing zone, People's Tower, and the Central District were the new pre-event zones. These zones could initially only be accessed for a limited time, prior to the epilogue of Ziost's story, whereas the Immortal Emperor returns and consumes the planet using ancient Sith magic. Upon finishing the story quest, Ziost is left as a husk of its former self, with most if not all the inhabitants consumed by the Emperor's force power. The player, upon completion, can explore the daily zone of Ziost, titled the Military Outpost, which features an array of weekly and daily quests that utilize the macro binoculars and seeker droids to uncover the mysteries from within the zone. Ziost also featured a singular raid boss called the Colossal Monolith that had a very interesting hard mode mechanic. The mechanic required players to pick up a coloured debuff and then position themselves around the boss as it begins siphoning a rift. This would in turn interrupt the boss's cast. The mechanic was used rather interestingly to optimize the run. For example, the red debuff increased damage dealt by 20%, meaning a DPS could take much better advantage of the buff than say a healer or tank. This made for some very interesting clears and progression. The planet further offered a world boss titled the Worldbreaker Monolith, which had a few mechanics concerning ad placements, but was for the most part treated like any other world boss. A small controversy arose at the time concerning the planet, as a fair few quests and optional achievements required the use of the pre-event zones. For example, the Aegis of Zyos Legacy title required players to slay the 5 Aegis Squadron Walkers, which were small pre-event world bosses exclusive to pre-event zones. Player mentality at the time, especially for completionists, was very linear, in the sense that players would complete a storyline and then 100% the zone shortly after. Unfortunately, with how the zone was designed, players could not obtain 100% upon completing the storyline, resulting in multiple forum threads and Reddit posts asking the developers to allow players to return. Accompanying this abundance of new quests, story missions and zones, the player would also receive the new quality of life feature, the Outfit Designer. The Outfit Designer allowed players to separate their statistical gear from their cosmetic armor, similar in style to the World of Warcraft transmog system. The feature allowed players to create 16 outfits and switch between them at ease. With this sudden switch to cosmetics, players began flocking to the game in troves as role players, content creators and outfitters engaged actively with the new system, coining the term Space Barbie Simulator, which became a far too frequent saying. Despite the patch's majorative success, there was however one slight oversight concerning a small update to the Cartel Bazaar. Players could buy a new item titled the Temple Chair that scaled off of the Estran export reputation. The chair had little value and was relatively easy to obtain, and not much came of the item itself until the developers changed the purchase value of the item to 1 credit, as the item wasn't really in high demand and players were often complaining about the lack of easy to obtain decorations, so this change under normal circumstances would have been more than welcomed. But unfortunately, upon making the change, the developers forgot to alter the item's sellback price, which remained at 100 credits, meaning players could purchase the chair for 1 credit and sell it back for 100. The Temple Chair exploit was hotfixed within a few days, but in that time players managed to bulk purchase and sell back the chair to amass infinite credits on multiple tunes. Eric Musco, the community manager at the time and now game producer, made it clear that bans would be issued to anyone using the exploit before its fix. However, this did not stop players from exploiting the oversight and doing significant damage to the game's economy. As the game was free to play, players could simply make new accounts and abuse the exploit anonymously. The problem wasn't the direct use of the exploit per se, but instead the aftermath caused by the exploit. Players who used the exploit directly were indeed banned within a few hours in some cases, but those who indirectly benefited from the exploit, like GTN scammers, were left unscathed. I, for example, knew multiple guilds who utilised the exploit to redistribute funds across the GTN in an attempt to intentionally collapse server economies. And as there was no full rollback ever issued, this credit injection ultimately had a huge impact on the game's economy, with the effects still visible to this day. This whole incident may have actually contributed rather massively to the first wave of hyperinflation. This credit injection furthermore hit communities on every level as prices skyrocketed in the weeks to come, and players who had indirectly associated themselves with the credit exploit in some cases found themselves banned without reason. There were often sales runners who were helping players with titles and rare mounts, only to find that the credits they received were from the exploit and were therefore banned. Fortunately, going forward, Bioware had learnt from the error, and now when similar exploits arise, like the companion gift exploit, the development team isn't afraid to push hotfixes immediately. Despite the exploit, patch 3.2 was well received as players were mostly happy with the content available, and were looking forward to observing the teased content following the Grand Togruta celebration, which was an interesting event to say the least. The developer's livestream served as the initial reveal for patch 3.3, the Grand Togruta celebration. The stream was a little bit of a disaster, and the stream settings were not synced properly to Twitch, resulting in abysmal bitrate and resolution, but it was passable. Players here were introduced to new features accompanying the patch, the first being the Togruta species, this being Ahsoka Tano's race as featured in the Clone Wars TV series, and more recently in The Mandalorian. The second big reveal was the upcoming Yavin 4 stronghold, and was uniquely in high demand as the stronghold itself was pitched to be more of a guild base rather than a personal homestead. However, the stronghold could of course be used for both. More interestingly, patch 3.3 was to many's surprise the last patch of Shadow of Revan. Unlike Launch and Rise of the Hutt Cartel, Saw would only receive 3 content patches, which in turn produced a lot of confusion amongst the MMO community. SWTOR abruptly and suddenly just stopped. For a few weeks, the Doomsayers, WoW elitists and SWTOR skeptics had their way with the game. This was it. Maintenance mode. Completely unjustified maintenance mode. The end of it all. Of course, the bulk of news outlets had reported that SWTOR had just made record high profits off the cartel market, and the launch of SOAR was actually receiving extraordinary feedback for the most part. It was an odd time to say the least. During this period, RP guilds and PvP guilds made up the bulk of the player base as raiders had no more on-tier content to clear, and most everyone at this point had caught up with the storyline, ready for new content. Which begs the question, why the silence? Little did we know, SWTOR was about to change forever. The first few years following SWTOR's launch have without a doubt changed the MMO industry forever. SWTOR in itself was the first fully voiced MMORPG of this scale, the first MMO to offer a fully immersive narrative experience within the Old Republic era of the Star Wars IP, which furthermore offered 8 class story missions alongside countless side quests and flashpoints for the player base to engage with. EA and its subsidiary Bioware had successfully produced 2 fully fleshed out expansions, each featuring their own raids, warzone arenas, and quality of life improvements that had ultimately revolutionized the way we play SWTOR today. And with that said, we conclude Star Wars The Old Republic Unmasked, a 3-part documentary series spanning SWTOR's launch and first 2 major expansions. Going forward, I aim to continue this series with a follow-up documentary titled SWTOR Endured that covers the second half decade of SWTOR's history, following from the Shadow of Revan expansion. If this is something you would like to see or would be interested in, please do engage with the video, otherwise it's hard to know what sort of content the broader SWTOR fanbase wants to see. And with that said, we wrap up the first half of this 2-part documentary series. I would like to start off by thanking the data miners, commentators, and supporters of the Star Wars The Old Republic MMORPG, the players who actively work to maintain and motivate the existing SWTOR community. Without yourselves, players like myself would not have the energy or motivation to create content of this scale, so thank you very much for your hard work, and for enabling content creators to do what we love. This 2-part video series alone has been in development since the start of 2021, which at the time of writing spans my 1-year anniversary on the project. This documentary series has required a hefty amount of work, be it writing, researching, fact-checking, recording, animating, editing, distributing, you name it. Throughout this video creation process, I've been hands-on with every element of content creation in an effort to produce a documentary series that sums up a decade's worth of MMO content. I would further like to thank the developers who keep the MMO going. Charles Boyd has always gone above and beyond to assure SWTOR's community is motivated and engaged, going as far as to personally attend interviews and Q&As with content creators. This level of engagement is voluntary and shows how respectful Boyd is of the SWTOR community, so I would like to thank him for his continued work on the game and his most recent contributions as game director for the latest expansion. I would also like to thank former producer Ben Ivering and now lead producer Keith Knegg for their managing and handling of game operations in more recent years. Producing a game of this size and scale is no easy feat. I'm sure countless meetings were had with Electronic Arts and their other subsidiaries, and I'm sure they had you constantly engaged with various hurdles across production, so thank you again for all the time you put in, the people you bring onto the project, and the hours of stress you endure so that people can play an online game. Your hard work doesn't fall on deaf ears, despite what the forum may have you believe. I would also like to personally thank Eric Musco and Daniel Steed, who were always exceptional with supporting me alongside my time in the Influencer, now Content Creator program. I wish Daniel luck with the Content Creator program going forward, and hope it continues to grow alongside the MMO. And of course, a huge thank you to the rest of the development team, from Ink Young Lee's breathtaking concept art to Matt Puchevich's amazing operation designs. Thank you all to the developers for making Star Wars The Old Republic what it is today. Any engagement with this video of course would be greatly appreciated, as I often read comments and engage with community members to re-energize myself after a long recording session, so please feel free to pop a message in the comment section below, or you're more than welcome to join my personal Discord, the link to which is in the description. Any support to the channel means a lot. I've also unlocked the join option on YouTube for those of you who would like access to exclusive badges and video content as a thank you for financially supporting the channel. I've also opened up a Patreon, the link to which is in the description also. Thank you again for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the first half of this documentary series, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Here's to another 10 incredible years of Star Wars The Old Republic.